Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. Both of them have one thing in common. When your luck runs out inside of a cave, things go south in no time. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On Friday, December 12th, 1981, two teenagers, Ronald Ames, 16, and Robert Tabor, 19, left school with a plan to explore the Cracksville cave system, located near their hometown. It wasn't unusual for them to go caving together, as they had been exploring local caves for months. They had a habit of venturing out on their own, often without notifying anyone of their precise whereabouts or return time. On that Friday afternoon, after school let out, they gathered near the bus stop. They were dressed in standard casual attire, shirts, jeans, sneakers, and, for the cold weather, coats, knit caps, and gloves. Before heading into the woods, they made a quick stop at the local grocery store, where they purchased a 12-pack of beer, 3 packs of cigarettes, and an ashtray with standard batteries. They were no strangers to the cave system and had made similar trips before, so they didn't feel the need to bring anything other than the essentials, their 2 flashlights and the batteries. They both knew the cave well and felt confident in their abilities to navigate it, even if things went wrong. The two young men were eager for a night of exploration, unaware that they would be facing something far more dangerous than they could ever have anticipated. Around 2:45 p.m., they entered the ward entrance of Cracksville Cave. This was a popular entry point, a relatively well-known route into the cave system. As they made their way deeper into the earth, the air grew colder, and the light began to fade. It wasn't long before they left a note on a log near the entrance, a standard precaution they had taken in the past. The note outlined their expected time of exit and provided contact information in case anyone needed to reach them. It was clear they had no intentions of being gone for long, but it was a necessary precaution nonetheless. Once inside, the two began exploring the cave in a familiar route, heading toward the big room, which was their usual starting point. This vast cavern marked the beginning of many of their previous adventures. They marveled at the stalactites and stalagmites that filled the chamber, enjoying the familiar sights that had never failed to captivate them. They made their way south toward the Gregory section, where the passageways began to narrow. The air grew damp and chillier, but they pressed on, confident they could handle the conditions. After navigating the Ward Gregory link, the two continued through the slick-inside block room before entering the bathtub, a part of the cave where the air grew even colder and water dripped from the ceilings. They then proceeded down Cook Avenue, an especially treacherous section of the cave. Passing the Rimstone Dams, they eventually stopped at Bindley's Sump, a notorious point in the cave. They had reached a point where their flashlights were beginning to flicker, signaling the batteries were starting to give out. With no spare batteries, they knew they were running on borrowed time. One of the flashlights dropped, which added to their frustration. They fumbled around in the dim light, trying to move quickly, knowing their only hope of getting out was to retrace their steps and find the exit before the light completely failed them. Unfortunately, as the minutes passed, both flashlights died. In the cold, wet environment of the cave, the temperature hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the boys quickly realized they had no way of navigating the cave in the dark. Panic began to set in, but they tried to stay calm. Tabor, who was leading, searched the walls for any sign of a way out. The cave seemed endless. Their flashlights were dead, their batteries depleted, and they had no food or extra clothing. The only thing they could rely on was each other and the faint glimmers of hope that maybe, just maybe, they would find their way back. But as the hours passed, their situation grew more dire. They huddled together for warmth under a single coat, squeezing every last bit of body heat from each other. The cold, combined with the dampness of the cave, made it nearly impossible to stay warm. They knew they had to stay alert, but the exhaustion of their search and the cold temperatures made it difficult to focus. Time dragged on. It became clear that they had not only ventured deeper into the cave than they had planned, but they were also trapped. Their search for an exit took them further into unknown passages. The cave system had many twists and turns, and without proper light, they had no way of telling which way they had come or where they had to go. As darkness fell outside the cave, Ames and Tabor's desperation mounted. They realized they might be stuck for much longer than they had anticipated. With no food and no way to signal for help, they tried to keep each other's spirits up. They talked about anything that came to mind, their conversations drifting from one topic to another. They were just trying to distract themselves from the terrifying reality of their situation. They took turns searching the cave, but the further they went, the more hopeless it seemed. By Saturday morning, December 13th, word had spread about their disappearance. Their families were frantic and began contacting friends and relatives, trying to locate the boys. At first, it was assumed they had gone on a spontaneous trip and would return soon. But by Sunday, concerns started to grow. Karen Boggs, a counselor at their high school, had been trying to reach Tabor all weekend without success. After several attempts to contact him, she realized something was wrong. She contacted their teachers, and it quickly became clear that the boys hadn't just gone on a short trip. They were likely stranded in the cave. On Tuesday, December 16th, Karen spoke to Nick Visco, another teacher at the school who was also an avid caver. Visco immediately suggested that a rescue team should be assembled to search for the boys. He had been to Cracksville Cave many times and was familiar with its layout. With his encouragement, an official search effort was organized. By Wednesday, a group of cavers and rescuers gathered at the Clarksville supermarket to prepare for the search. At 5 p.m. on Wednesday, December the 17th, the first team entered the cave through the Gregory entrance. They had a clear plan to search the areas the boys were most likely to have passed through. They began by heading toward Bindley's Sump, but after searching the area for over 30 minutes, they found no sign of the boys. The cave was cold and damp, and the search teams had to battle their own exhaustion as they pressed on through narrow passageways and thick mud. The search seemed endless. A second team entered the cave at 6:15 p.m., checking for any clues further along the passages leading to Bindley's Sump. They encountered the same frustrations as the first group. No signs, no clues, no evidence that the boys had been in that section of the cave. Time was running out. The rescue teams knew that if they didn't find the boys soon, it could be too late. At 6:40 p.m., a third team entered the cave through the ward entrance, heading toward the lake room to search the farthest reaches of the cave system. As the hours passed, the search continued. Each team that entered the cave reported no signs of the boys, and by 9 p.m., the situation was growing more desperate. The teams were starting to lose hope. But then, just as the situation was starting to feel hopeless, the first breakthrough came. A team member reported seeing something that appeared to be footprints. Further investigation revealed abandoned items, torn clothing, and other personal belongings. At last, the rescue teams had confirmation that the boys had been in the cave. They pressed forward with renewed urgency. At 9:25 p.m., an emergency team entered the cave, determined to find the boys and bring them out. After what must have felt like an eternity for the search teams, they finally located Ames and Tabor. The boys were found in a near hypothermic state, severely dehydrated and suffering from frostbite and numbness in their extremities. They had been trapped in the cave for nearly 4 days. Their condition was critical, but they were alive. The rescue team worked quickly, administering first aid as they prepared the boys for evacuation. The harsh reality of the situation was evident. The boys were lucky to be alive, and their ordeal had taken a significant toll on their physical and mental state. By 9:45 p.m., Ames and Tabor were safely in an ambulance on their way to the hospital. The boys had been incredibly lucky to survive such a harrowing experience. The boys spent several days in the hospital, recovering from their ordeal. They were lucky to have made it out alive. In the weeks that followed, they both reflected on their experience and the importance of safety when venturing into the unknown. Their story became an inspiration to other cavers, a reminder of the importance of being prepared, staying alert, and always respecting the cave. While these boys were fortunate enough to escape the nightmare without casualties, the next story tells of two who weren't as lucky. On the morning of February 9th, 2019, two Italian divers, Carlo Basso and Carlo Barbieri, prepared to explore the famous El Dudu cave system in the Dominican Republic. The cave, known for its labyrinthine passages and striking underwater scenery, attracts divers from all over the world. For many, it represents a challenge, a place where skill and courage are tested. Basso and Barbieri, though not certified for cave diving, appeared undeterred. Their recreational diving experience gave them confidence, but confidence alone is no substitute for the specialized training required to navigate underwater caves. By 11:50 a.m., the pair had entered the water. Their excitement was evident, and their gear, though suited for open water diving rather than caves, seemed in order. They moved smoothly at first, following the main guideline, a lifeline for divers in these submerged mazes. This line, secured to the cave's interior, was their connection to the surface. With no natural light and endless twists and turns, the guideline is a diver's only assurance of finding the way back. The initial phase of their dive appeared uneventful. Basso and Barbieri swam deeper into the system. However, as they ventured farther, the underwater world grew darker and more constricted. The beauty of the wide-open spaces near the entrance gave way to narrow corridors and oppressive silence. Then came the critical moment. Somewhere deep within the cave, they encountered a jump. A jump is a secondary line that branches off the main guideline, leading to side passages that can be far more treacherous. These jumps are intentionally set apart to prevent inexperienced divers from accidentally following them. Only divers with advanced training know how to handle such a junction, using a jump reel to connect the secondary line back to the main one. But something happened. Basso and Barbieri deviated from the main guideline and entered the side passage without taking the necessary precautions. Perhaps it was curiosity, an eagerness to explore, or even a simple lapse in judgment. As they pushed into the narrower space, the environment began to change. The passage was tight, and their movements disturbed the fine silt coating the cave floor and walls. Within moments, the crystal-clear water turned murky, reducing visibility to nearly zero. In these conditions, even experienced divers with proper equipment can struggle to maintain their bearings. For Basso and Barbieri, who lacked cave diving training, the situation rapidly deteriorated. The silt enveloped them, creating a blinding fog. Their flashlights, so effective moments ago, now reflected off the suspended particles, rendering them useless. The once pristine underwater world had transformed into a claustrophobic nightmare. Every movement stirred up more silt, compounding their disorientation. The main guideline, their tether to safety, was now out of reach. Without it, the chances of navigating back to the surface diminished drastically. Panic began to set in as they realized the gravity of their situation. In the confined space, communicating was almost impossible. Hand signals, the primary method for divers, were obscured by the swirling silt. Time became an enemy. The air supply in their tanks was finite, and every panicked breath consumed it faster. Their lack of training meant they were unprepared for this kind of emergency. The silence of the cave, once serene, was now oppressive, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the occasional clang of equipment against rock. Somewhere in that dark, silty corridor, the two divers continued to move, perhaps in an attempt to find the main guideline or an alternate exit. Each turn, each effort to push forward, likely felt like a gamble. Were they getting closer to safety or venturing deeper into danger? For Basso and Barbieri, the sense of isolation was overwhelming. The weight of the water above them, the encroaching darkness, and the dwindling air supply created an inescapable sense of urgency. They were far from the tranquil waters they had expected to explore, trapped instead in an environment that demanded precision and expertise they did not possess. The minutes stretched on, each one more critical than the last. Compounding the situation, Basso's front-mounted stage cylinder became entangled in the cave line. In his effort to press forward, the guideline snapped, trailing behind him. This severed their only reliable connection to the main guideline and the cave's exit. Trapped in an unfamiliar passage with no clear direction and rapidly diminishing air supplies, the divers found themselves in a life-threatening situation. The severed line rendered navigation nearly impossible, while the silt stirred by their movements turned the water into a suffocating haze. When Basso and Barbieri failed to surface by mid-afternoon, concern quickly grew among those waiting on land. Divers who venture into caves typically follow strict schedules, as even minor delays can signal serious trouble. The Dominican Republic's Speleological Society, DRSS, was notified, and two of its most experienced divers, Philip Lehman and Angel Comprez, prepared to search for the missing pair. The initial search began under challenging conditions. Lehman and Comprez entered the cave, following the main guideline and scanning for any sign of the missing divers. It wasn't long before they encountered heavily silted water, the first indication of trouble. The stirred-up silt was a telltale sign that Basso and Barbieri had ventured into an unstable area, likely a side passage. As the rescuers pressed deeper into the system, they discovered a broken guideline leading into a narrow, silty corridor. This discovery confirmed their worst fears. The divers had strayed from the main line, severing their only reliable connection to the cave's entrance. Without this guide, they would have been left to navigate the maze-like system blind, a near impossible task for even the most experienced divers. Lehman and Comprez cautiously entered the side passage, but the conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The dense silt made visibility almost non-existent, forcing the rescuers to rely on touch and memory to progress. The narrow corridor further hampered their efforts, leaving little room to maneuver or search effectively. After hours of painstaking work, they were forced to retreat without finding any sign of the missing divers. The next day, the search resumed under equally challenging conditions. The silt cloud from the previous day's disturbance had not settled, and visibility remained near zero. The rescuers faced mounting frustration as they combed the labyrinthine passages, knowing that every passing hour diminished the chances of a successful recovery. On February 12th, 3 days after Basso and Barbieri had entered the cave, the rescuers finally located one of the missing divers. Carlo Barbieri's body was found wedged in a narrow side passage, his position so restrictive that even the experienced recovery divers struggled to reach him. His equipment showed no signs of failure, suggesting that his death was likely the result of suffocation or drowning, both common outcomes for divers trapped in tight, silty spaces. Despite their best efforts, the rescuers were unable to retrieve Barbieri's body. The narrow confines of the passage made it impossible to maneuver safely, and the risk of further disturbing the already unstable environment was too great. The team reluctantly decided to leave Barbieri where he was and continued their search for Basso. For the next several days, the recovery effort faced one obstacle after another. The dense silt cloud showed no signs of settling, and the intricate maze of the cave system made it difficult to determine where Basso might have gone. By February 21st, after nearly 2 weeks of searching, the local recovery team decided to halt their efforts. The risks had become too great, and there was little hope of finding Basso alive. With the situation growing increasingly dire, 2 American divers, Ed Sorensen and Mike Young, were called in to assist. Both men were renowned for their expertise in cave diving recoveries, particularly in low visibility and high-risk environments. However, their arrival was met with resistance from local officials, who feared that the recovery effort was too dangerous. After tense negotiations, Sorensen and Young were given permission to proceed, but with a strict deadline of 8 days to complete their mission. Their first priority was to recover Carlo Barbieri's body. Using specialized equipment, including a harness designed for tight spaces and a 4-point anchor system for stability, Sorensen and Young carefully maneuvered into the narrow passage where Barbieri had been found. The recovery took 4 hours, requiring meticulous work in zero visibility conditions. Despite the challenges, they successfully brought Barbieri's body to the surface, providing some closure to his grieving family. The next day, the Americans turned their attention to finding Carlo Basso. Pushing beyond the point where Barbieri had been discovered, Sorensen encountered a crevice at the end of the passage. There, in complete darkness, he found Basso's body, wedged tightly in the confined space. To free the body, Sorensen had to cut away Basso's entangled equipment, including his back-mounted cylinder, which floated upward, indicating it was empty. His front-mounted cylinder, still full, sank into the crevice, suggesting that Basso had struggled desperately in his final moments. After disentangling the body, Sorensen and Young followed the same recovery process used for Barbieri. 4 hours later, they brought Basso's remains to the surface, concluding one of the most challenging recovery efforts in the history of the El Dudu cave system.